something I wanted to chat with you about, since you have done so much lactate testing back in the day, and I've been trying to parse through the research to find those links between lactate and O2 trends that we can get out of a Moxy. So without going back into what lactate theory was before,
sure.
From your standpoint today in 2021, how does lactate work in the body, and how does it relate to oxygen levels in general? Can we draw this parallel? And why do you think that we don't need that measure of lactate anymore?
Okay, so to simplify it a little bit, so lactate is just a breakdown of sugar. It's a breakdown of glucose. It's half a glucose molecule. It's a 3-carbon sugar. The only reason we have lactate in the system is because of the breakdown of sugars. So when lactate accumulates in the system, it's because we have increased our breakdown of glucose. And it gets broken down through glycolysis to pyruvate, and pyruvate gets stuck inside a cell and can't get out. So the reason we don't measure we should be measuring pyruvate, but we can't because it's cell bound. So for pyruvate to move through the system, it has to hydroxylate and becomes lactate so that it can actually pass through the cell membrane and into the bloodstream. So we measure lactate as an indirect measure of breakdowns of sugars. Once lactate's in the system, and this is again where the challenging part from old theory goes, is that we knew that the harder someone worked, the more lactate accumulated in the system. And it was erroneously thought that the lactate was the cause of all the problems that happened. And once that became stuck in people's heads and they had an easy measurement of that breakdown of sugars, it became something that people used. And there's a ski coach asked me this the other day. He said, if lactate's so misunderstood, why do we continue to use it? I said, because it's simple, it's portable, and people think it's easy to understand. So
and maybe sorry to cut you off, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from my understanding now is that you, like you said, you produce lactate from the breakdown of sugars from glycolysis in the cytosol of the cell, and then but you're also going to have that lactate that's going to be it can be oxidized by either the fiber or the cell itself or neighboring fibers, especially type 1 fibers. So they have high mitochondrial density and function, and they can reuse that lactate. So what you find in the blood is actually lactate produced minus lactate reutilized equals blood lactate. Is that kind of a
You're
fair?
Totally right.
Yeah.
So exactly. So if you go back to the understanding that lactate is just half a sugar molecule, then you realize that it's part of the way of the process of creating energy. So just like a glucose molecule is halfway broken down to pyruvate, and pyruvate can move into the Krebs cycle, so can lactate. And lactate's the only way you can get it from one cell to another. So it has to go into the bloodstream to be moved around and shuffled around to be able to use as a fuel source by other muscles, if you have other muscles to use it. So if you have muscles that have mitochondrial density in them to use it. So it's also a pathway to refueling the liver through glycogenolysis, right? So again, for people that we used to argue with people about that there's no number of lactate that means anything shouldn't mean anything to anybody. And so our key to that was we used to do resting lactates on everybody. And we would have them guess their numbers. And they would say, well, can you guess what my number is going to be? And I would say, well, so what do you think it's going to be? And they said, well, it'll be 0. I'm not exercising, I'm resting. I'm like, right. So first of all, you have to understand that you are not going to be 0. You always have lactate in your system. And I can make your lactate go up without you moving. All I have to do is give you a donut or a bagel or something high carbohydrate. You are going to absorb a bunch of sugars out of that, simple carbohydrates, and they are going to need to refuel your liver. So your body shifts it to lactate because it's the only way you can get it into the liver cells. So just by eating a high carbohydrate meal, I can make your lactate levels go up. And if you think that there's a threshold, and I can mess up your idea of a threshold by just having you eat carbohydrates, that doesn't make, that theory has to be questioned. And if you continue to hold on to that theory despite a high lactate level at rest, then that was, for me, it's an easy question to say, well, there's something wrong with the theory if I can mess it up very simply, but just by eating. Mm-hmm. And I could drive people crazy at a training camp where I could have them test every day for 7 days, because they would think, I think I understand it now, Andrew. My lactate levels will be up after, they'll be low before breakfast and they'll be high after breakfast. I'm like, right, but I'm going to mess up that even more by training on the day that we do the highest, hardest climb, where you tell me you worked as hard as you possibly can, and it's a 3 or 4 hour ride to get out there and back. We're going to completely deplete your glycogen stores. And that evening meal, I want you to not eat very many carbohydrates. I'm going to stay away from the bread table and just stick to salads. And when you come in the morning, I want you to try and refuel your liver completely by your morning breakfast. And we could show people that before breakfast, because they had no carbohydrates left in their system at the end of their bike ride and no carbohydrates the evening before, their lactate levels were lower than their average from the rest of the camp. Mm-hmm. And we could push them, some of them were almost zero, because they had no carbohydrates floating through their system to break down into lactate. Mm-hmm. So we could show that we had everybody's at their lowest values ever, mm-hmm. except for the people that cheated and had some carbs the night before. And they got really angry when I said, you cheated last night. I don't know what you had when you went back into your room, but you had some white bread or some buns. And they're like, oh, how did you find it? So, well, because your lactate's a little bit higher than everybody else. Now I want you to go have breakfast and then come back and sit, and we'll do resting lactates one more time around the table. And these tables are 10 people. They're just average athletes that were just on a camp and were just interested in listening to us spout on about lactate. And they'd all have and I said, you can have whatever you want for breakfast, but I guarantee the people that have more carbohydrates for breakfast will have higher lactates at the end of this. And sure enough, and we pushed people into 12 and 14 millimoles of lactate sitting at the breakfast table. And it just, the first time, first couple of times we did it, they're like, there's something wrong with your monitor. I'm like, sure, you can believe that the monitor that's a medical grade point of care testing device that's used in hospitals around the world, there's something wrong with it. And I can poke, how many times do you want me to poke you before you see the number that you're going to believe? Mm-hmm. We'd done thousands of tests, so we were happy with the accuracy of the device. And 12 and 14 was not unseen and not unheard of if someone worked really hard the day before and then tried to refuel their liver with a bunch of carbohydrates in the morning.
It's fascinating because, again, I came at all this very late, literally like a year ago, when I found Evan's course on the Training Think Tank Classroom and started figuring out that all the theory or all the underlying model of bioenergetics that I had learned and thought that I had mastered was actually not as correct as I thought it was. And then, so, in finding the Moxy as a tool, since, you and Jörg, who kind of Jörg started this whole thing really, since you guys had been doing lactate testing for so long and actually dropped it in favor of using a tool like the Moxy, I always thought, well, that just makes sense, and I don't necessarily need to go back and relearn lactate to go forward. Recently, I fell on a podcast, the Peter Attia, the Drive podcast. For those who know it, I think the podcast is about 2 years old, and it's with Inigo San Milan, who coached last year's Tour de France winner, for reference, for those who don't know the name. And you definitely should go check out this podcast if you like physiology, because it's absolutely fascinating. He also works in cancer and diabetes research, and just hearing him talk about that lactate, steady state, and how he uses this with his athletes. I don't know if he still does today, but he definitely did a couple of years ago. We
can talk about that a little bit. So the lactate steady state is actually based on Jörg's balance point test, which is fascinating because they tried to mimic it through study and burn, and this was one of the really tragic stories of Jörg's history, was that they didn't ask enough questions before they did the study, And the PhD student ended up writing a PhD and getting credit for development of the MLSS test based on Jurg's ideas, without giving him credit for what he brought to the table. And so with lactate, so after we take care of the resting lactate and all the problems with the carbohydrate metabolism and stuff, when you actually start exercising and the use of lactate, and this is where, again, there is benefits to using lactate if you're understanding how it gets moved around and how the trends of lactate indicate what's happening globally in the body. And I would use lactate in the same way that I would use oxygen consumption, as a global look at what's going on, with the Moxy looking at what's happening locally for oxygen consumption. Lactate can do the same thing. It shows what happens globally in the system, whereas Moxy looks at what's happening at the local level. So the production of lactate is a breakdown of sugars locally. It shifts around, and how it trends is how the body is making use of it globally. And if you are well trained from an endurance point of view, and you have a ton of mitochondria and a ton of peripheral muscles, then you can make use of that lactate as a fuel source. And this is why, if you test enough athletes, you'll see some athletes who are very highly trained never accumulate 4 millimoles of lactate. They don't have the ability to burn sugars fast enough to override the amount that's being used by the mitochondria. And this does not mean that they can't be world-class, and this is world-class marathon runners, and some of our best cyclists can't hit 4 millimoles. Now, they may not be able to burn sugars fast enough to produce a world-class sprint, but I guarantee you, if those athletes are able to have any coordination on a bike or running, they will outrun most of your under-trained athletes, because they're showing you that they have the ability to move lactate around the system. And make use of it.
I guess another.
Yeah,
go ahead. You go.
I was just saying that I think there is still a use for lactate if you either don't have access to Moxy, or aren't willing to actually understand a new level of theory. If you're still tied to lactate, then at least understand that you can use it, and it's a global look, and it's delayed. Because if you're taking a finger poke lactate, first of all, it takes you at least a minute before you see the number show up. And it's taking you, even when we were really good, we actually were testing athletes during exercise. So we just found ways to support our hands and be able to do it so that they didn't have to stop. I had a test the other day that someone was asking Peter to analyze, because they were having to stop the athlete to do the lactate test. And then they were asking how to analyze what was happening in the oxygen consumption. I said, well, you just stopped an athlete from running. So if you're going to do that, at least do a 5:15. But he was trying to do a step test with lactate. I said, well, he clearly doesn't, the whole conversation needs to shift about how to analyze the oxygen consumption data, because he clearly doesn't understand the physiology behind lactate and oxygen consumption if he's stopping an athlete in the middle of a test to test something that is going to give him an answer 2 minutes later, and then be reflective of what happened 2 minutes earlier. So if we could give him a Moxy and actually sit down with him and educate him a little bit, we could actually show him this is exactly what's happening right this second. Don't stop him running. You can see what's happening. You can try speeding him up and slowing him down and watch how that changes. And so I think you're on although you're not on the cutting edge of this, you are on the leading edge of a global shift in understanding of physiology. And I think that's why it's been really fun to hear your podcast, is the number of young scientists that are on your podcast that are relatively new to this. When you look at the number of years that Jurg tried to have people help understand how their bodies worked, and how we taught lactate courses for 10 years that were based on the understandings that we were very easily able to adopt into Moxy. So nothing we taught in those lactate courses was wrong. It's just way easier to understand what we were trying to teach now that we have Moxy to demonstrate what we were saying back then. And I think you are on the leading edge of a bigger, a more deeper understanding, but also a more accepted understanding of what a few people were trying to teach 10 years ago is now being understood by a larger number of people.
Yeah, and Go ahead, Peter.
If I can just throw a little pitch in there, if you do have several Moxys and you want a simple way to collect them in the field, you should go download the VO2 Master Manager app right now on iOS and Android.